Um, Welcome everybody. If you've never met me before, my name is Kelly Fowler. I am an undergraduate, a senior undergraduate in the Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources Department. I'm also in the Marine Science Department. I am currently the president of the Rutgers Wildlife Society, and I will be leaving you all after the semester is through. I'm going to be graduating. I'm an off-schedule graduate. And we're going to be holding elections for the next president. So it's going to be me. You're going to see my face for the next few meetings, and then I'll probably join in as a participant when I can. So in case anybody is new here, I just wanted to briefly go over what the Wildlife Society is. Some of you have maybe never heard of it. Some of you have maybe heard this 1,000 times, so I'll try to keep it a little brief. So the Wildlife Society is an international nonprofit association. We are a student chapter of it, but it's actually a multinational professional society for wildlife biologists and people in wildlife education and everything like that. So there's state and regional chapters. If you join the National Wildlife Society, you could pay a few extra bucks, I think it's $5 extra to be a part of the state chapter, and then you can go to all the state meetings and be a part of that. There's regional areas, so we were part of the Northeast region, both for the normal professional wildlife society, and then we have the student part of the Northeast region. And that student Northeast region does a student conclave every year, which unfortunately will likely be canceled this year due to COVID restrictions, but it's a really great networking opportunity for students who are interested in joining. We pay for it, it's part of our budget, and then we go up to a different school every single year and do all of these amazing workshops with different students in wildlife societies all over the Northeast and SUNY ESF, and sometimes we get just a large smattering of different schools show up, and it's really great. You get to meet people that are in the same position as you, but in all different areas of the Northeast. So if anybody is interested in joining the Wildlife Society, the National Wildlife Society, it's relatively inexpensive for students. I believe it's $32, and you get access to a lot of resources, which you can find at wildlife.org. And our student chapter, we do a lot of things at Rutgers. We are trail stewards for the Rutgers Eco Preserve. If nobody's ever been, it's amazing on Livingston campus. Really great birding there, really great hiking there. We do bird banding very often. We do winter bird banding. We do a saw-whet owl trip, do a spring bird banding trip most years, which we weren't able to do last year. Last year, as you can see in this picture, we did hunter education. So this is the Wildlife Society learning how to shoot guns and crossbows and getting us our hunter's license, doing the hunter education. So hopefully some of the people that were there that day are here right now. That's me right there. We were going to be doing a prescribed burn down in the Pinelands. That was unfortunately canceled, but we are still in communication with the person that is setting that up. So hopefully once COVID restrictions are over, we'll be able to do a burn in the Pinelands. It's a really great thing for ecologists to know how to do and be involved with. And yeah, so if anybody has just joined for the first time, it is a lot of fun. So hopefully you enjoy our virtual meetings, but you can look forward to some pretty fun in-person stuff in the future. And we just wanted to do a little blurb about all of our different board members. I introduced myself, I'm Kelly. I'm mainly working with bats. I'm doing my GH Cook thesis on how invasive species removal can impact bat species, foraging, ecology, and presence. I mainly do monitoring for bats with the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife in the summer times. And this is a picture of me in Antarctica. I was lucky enough to go down to Antarctica to do some phytoplankton research. So that's me pretending to be a marine biologist and a bird biologist. And Lori, if you're here, you can unmute your mic and do your little blurb.
Hi, my name is Lori. I'm a senior as well. I graduated the spring of 21. Right now I am doing research with Dr. Russell, and she is studying bees. Well, my GH Cook thesis is going to be on maximizing the efficiency of surveying methods of bees. I don't know, a fun fact, I do scuba diving.
All right, thank you. And Courtney, our secretary.
Hey, so I'm Courtney Randick. I'm a junior majoring in ecology, evolution, and natural resources, and I'm pursuing a certificate in GIS. I'm also the secretary for the Wildlife Society. During the semester, I work in the Moran lab with a graduate student studying DeKay's brown snake, and I'm also the secretary for the Forestry Club. Outside of school, I actually work for the New Jersey State Park Service at Bass River State Forest.
Awesome. Grace is unfortunately not going to be here. She's going to be here like 10-15 minutes late. So this is Grace. She works in the Mazel lab. Also, I work in the Mazel lab with bats. She does a lot of cool stuff. Hopefully you all get to meet her virtually sometime soon. And Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm a sophomore right now, studying animal science on the pre-vet track, and I'm doing research right now with Dr. Ellen Rankin on horse behavior. But I'm going to be helping posting social media updates on our meetings, and I'm so excited to be back together as a club.
Thank you. And without further ado, we're going to be introducing Meagan Racey from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Just a small bit, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just a small bit of housekeeping. So if everybody could keep their mics muted. If you have any questions for Meagan or I about Wildlife Society stuff or about her talk, you can put it in the chat, and in the last like 15 minutes, I'll just go through each of them. So thank you all, and Meagan, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. And I really appreciate you all inviting me to come speak with you. And it's going to be super casual. I'll just share a little bit about who I am, what I do, and then I'd love to answer questions that you all have and just have a conversation with you all to see how I can be of most use and most informative to your time tonight. So I'll just start with, I just hit my 10-year anniversary with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work out of our North Atlantic Appalachian Regional Office. So we've traditionally covered from Maine down to Virginia and West Virginia. So we're located here in Western Massachusetts, but we oversee a large amount of work across all of those states. And just recently we changed from the Northeast region to the North Atlantic Appalachian region in an effort to have more cohesion with our other agencies in the Department of Interior. So that includes like National Park Service, if you're familiar, of course, with them, and like USGS and some other agencies that we work regularly with. And so now we share regions with them, and we'll be transitioning to add Kentucky to our region. So just to give you kind of that sense of background, and I'm a public affairs specialist in our external affairs office. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but I think what I just wanted to go ahead and kick off my conversation with you is just a suggestion or a message that I have that you've probably heard from many other folks, and so I'll really be reiterating something that you're probably already doing and just emphasizing that you're on that track, the right track. And that is to just try as many opportunities as you can, to talk to as many folks as you can, and just to be open to opportunities that might be a little different than what you thought you were looking for. And that's how that last bit is really how I landed where I am working in public affairs with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was studying literature, and I transitioned to study both literature and journalism, and didn't have any real conservation science courses. But on the last, I think it was my last semester of my undergrad, when I got to cover what they would call an environmental beat. So, at news agencies, journalists cover beat areas. So it's basically their focus area or their topic area. So we use that language too here at Fish and Wildlife Service. But at the time, I was getting to cover a little bit of an environmental beat as a part of one of my last classes, essentially. And after I graduated, I was looking for all kinds of opportunities. I was looking at newspapers, I was looking at magazines, and I happened to come across this opportunity with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was going to be a 2-year opportunity at the time that had the opportunity to be converted to a permanent opportunity. I'll talk a little bit more about that too, because I'm sure you all may already be really familiar with federal hiring and opportunities, but I'll give you just a little bit of that later, and happy to answer any questions or point you to resources to talk a little bit more. But there are lots of different ways to try to get in with federal agencies for conservation. And so we'll just mention that. And I'll just say that mine was a 2-year opportunity that had the opportunity to be converted to be a federal permanent position. So it looked like a really good thing to try. And so I went for it. And you know, there was a little bit of nervousness there because journalists call kind of public relations sort of the dark side, you know, but you're maybe trying to sell sneakers or like designer clothes or something. But really the only dark side with Fish and Wildlife Service is dealing with bureaucracy or government, because from the mission perspective, we're selling conservation. And, you know, the people that who are doing that work could be no more dedicated, and the work could be no more fascinating. So that makes for a super compelling, great storytelling. And just honestly, wildlife conservation is one of the things that continues to pull very highly. So we have a lot of support from the American public in general, and you're really telling a story that needs to be told. And I like to think of it as telling a story with the characters that can't speak for themselves, right? So we're really sticking up for those creatures that really don't have a voice. And that to me was a very, like I said, compelling opportunity to try. So I went for that, and you know, that's now about a decade ago. And you know, I'll say that even as amazing as it is to do this kind of work, conservation work that is, and as you all know, the research and the opportunities involved, it's not, of course, without the challenges, right? And so some of Fish and Wildlife Service, some may think of Fish and Wildlife Service as being really more about like a lot of scientists sort of working away in the lab or working outdoors. But if you go to our website, and if you know the agency at all, and you know our mission, the very beginning of the mission is working with people. And while our conservation and wildlife challenges are significant, sometimes it's the working with people part that can be the harder part of the job that you'll hear from folks that I work with. And that's kind of where people like me come to help and support. And sort of, you could think of us as kind of like consultants. There's a lot of different ways that we work with the public and that we work with people. And some of them we're not really, you know, folks like me may not be too involved with. We've got folks, I mentioned before, my husband works for the same agency that I do, and he works with private landowners. And so it's really important that he can build relationships with people and be able to help people see the value of working with the federal government on their own private lands and what we can bring to the table to support them in meeting whatever missions they may have for their land while also conserving wildlife. So that's one example of, you know, working with people. We work with tons of partners as well, but external affairs specifically is the division that I work in. We also have folks who do a lot of public engagement through visitor services. So if you're more familiar with the National Park Service, you're probably familiar with park rangers and folks who are doing a lot of visitor engagement. We also have national wildlife refuges, and we're managing land and working with visitors and inviting folks to come and visit us in those properties. And so we've got folks who are doing a lot of visitor services engagement and education, interpretation, that kind of thing. So external affairs, though, is more about working with news media, advising kind of high-level partnerships, working with other government agencies, working with Congress, working with tribes. All of those sorts of specific entities fall under what external affairs oversees. And the idea is that we essentially coordinate and lead the public outreach for our agency and make sure that we're covering our priority issues and programs for the public. We also think of us as kind of like reputation management. So really keeping an eye on how we position the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the American public. And that looks like a lot of different things that I'd be happy to get more into. I didn't want to bore you with like the kinds of things the kinds of tools and things that I work on, but I'll just give you kind of a quick list, and I can absolutely go into more of that. But I will develop on any given day. I may work on for example, a communications package, which might be, let's say we're adding a species to the endangered species list. And we have to go through, a whole public process as a part of that. There's a scientific process behind the scenes. Once we come to a recommendation, there's a whole public process as well. And I'm involved heavily in trying to communicate that the scientific process, the opportunity for the public engagement, and then wherever the final decision lands. So we'll develop these packages that will pretty much explain, who's our target audience, what are we trying to communicate, how are we going to communicate it, what tools do we need, who's going to do it, when is it going to happen, and so it seriously outlines, very much step by step what's needed to kind of pull off a successful, perhaps an announcement, an event, whatever it may be. We also have a ton of different platforms that we're doing the storytelling on. So part of that communications package may talk about news releases. It may talk about social media, including blog storytelling. We do a little bit of, podcasting. We do video or multimedia, graphics, all of those sorts of things get covered in these. We do a ton of internal communications. We have both public websites and internal websites, and put a lot of energy into making sure our own employees know what are their colleagues working on, what is the leadership working on, how can we make sure that folks know what is the highest priority essentially for our region, and how they can contribute, how they can learn from one another, even especially now virtually, how can we help people that are working in far off parts of the region connect with one another, and be able to share case studies and do webinars and that sort of thing. We work on strategic communications too, which is a little bit more detailed thinking about what is it, what behaviors are we looking for from people, and what do we need in order to influence that, and really thinking through, the human dimensions, what does social science tell us, and really trying to incorporate that too. One of the more exciting things that I get to do is work with news media directly, and that's really exciting because often they're a channel to a significantly large audience for us. So whether it's, it could be a local outlet, maybe it's like a local paper or a weekly paper, it could be the state level of the National Public Radio, one of the affiliates, local affiliates for that. But we also get to work with like the New York Times, and just today actually I was on the phone with one of our subject matter experts, and he was doing an interview with somebody from the UK for a paper in an international paper over there, or an international online news outlet essentially. So get to do some really neat things from that perspective, and really trying to make sure that what we're doing gets out to the folks that we're doing that work for, and that have a stake in the work that we do. And some of that has been, we've gotten like National Public Radio out to do some cannon netting with shorebirds that migrate like nearly the length of the continent. So really fascinating things. The person I mentioned that I was on the phone with earlier was talking about why freshwater mussels have been mysteriously dying in one part of our region for several years now, and trying to kind of unravel that mystery. Then also I've been able to like send reporters out to an island that was a former bombing site where we were going to be releasing these really rare rabbits to start a backup population. So there's really, really cool stuff that my colleagues are doing, and I get to kind of shine a light on that essentially for folks across the country, across the region, just really depending on who we're trying to communicate to. And you may hear my dog is now lapping water in the background if you can hear that. So I'm happy to talk with you more about what I do or what External Affairs does, the division I work in. But I also wanted to just suggest to you all for the hiring process, you're probably already familiar with usajobs.gov. That is where all of our employment opportunities are advertised. But there's a lot of opportunities that, especially for you all with students or recent graduates, that if you're not already familiar with the Student Conservation Association, AmeriCorps, let's see, ACE, which I'm forget, the American maybe Conservation Experience is what that stands for. There's a website that I can send you all if you all don't already have that kind of information, but where it lists all of these kinds of organizations. But we have these really cool programs that you can participate in, such as I was just working this summer, I oversaw a directorate fellow for the Directorate Fellowship Program, where they work full-time for 3 months with us, and then they have the opportunity to be converted into a full-time permanent position, which is kind of what I did. I had a 2-year opportunity and then I was converted. And that's a really significant opportunity for you all, for anyone interested in federal government, to be able to make that kind of transition, because you all know the jobs are highly competitive. There's also, if you're familiar with the Public Lands Hiring Act, it's not the full name of the legislation, but essentially if you perform enough hours, both you have to do some in the field, and then you can do other, more hours that are office based. You get basically a leg up on the competition. You can qualify essentially as a federal employee for a certain amount of time after you finish those hours. So that helps with getting qualified and really getting on the basically the list of folks that the potential supervisor is going to be looking at. So we could talk more about the hiring process too if you'd like, but one thing that I also wanted to share with you all, that's something I wish I had done more of, that I know, just from you all being on this call, that you are doing that, but just to encourage you to spend a lot of time networking with the folks that you have access to. It's really amazing that even if they don't have maybe a connection right away, that those relationships can really come into play years later. I've reached out to a couple of professors just to bounce ideas off them as a part of my job in this position. And it's just having those relationships really could help you navigate the career world over the long haul. So just to encourage you to take advantage of those resources that you have now. But that's just my kind of short spiel, and I'm happy to go into any more detail on any of those other topics and any questions you have.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Meagan? I have a question. When it comes to applying on USA Jobs, I have heard that there's a lot of jobs that they already have a decision on who they're going to hire for, but they do go through a process of putting it up on USA Jobs. So I've heard that that's what is a bit of the competition factor and why it can be difficult to get one of those jobs. Is there any truth to that? Are they extremely competitive because there's a lot of people applying for them, or do you really have to know somebody to get one of those positions?
You do not have to know somebody to get one of those positions. I would say that there's the reality of any opportunity that comes up is that it does get advertised. Either it gets advertised publicly, but it also gets advertised internally, right? So anybody we're trying to spread the word. So absolutely, we'll go to our own peers, make sure people know about this job, this opportunity. So it's probably true that you would be competing with people who have connections or are already a part of the agency. But as a part of the hiring process, those folks who are qualified do get, and there's no I haven't hired someone officially through USA Jobs, so I'm not as aware of the process as other folks might be, but even if they are familiar with a candidate on the list, they'll still be interviewing and considering others as well. So I competed, for example, for the job I have now, and even I already knew the supervisor, but I competed alongside, obviously there was a longer list, but then when it came to the interview process, I interviewed alongside a number of other people for the position with a panel of folks. And there was a very structured process for, the question, and then for how to evaluate the responses and to get feedback from the panelists. And then the hiring manager makes the final decision. So I'm probably not the best person to speak to all the details in the hiring process, but I would definitely encourage you to not let a concern like that hold you back. And honestly, the more networking you do, even if you're not formally working with those folks, but just emailing, asking for informational interviews, that does help with name recognition for sure, and making sure that you are aware of any opportunities that might come up. There could be, contract opportunities that might not be on usajobs.gov, but would be an opportunity for you to get your kind of foot in the door.
Oh, that's really great information. I didn't know that. We have a question from Gabrielle. She says, what's the most rewarding part of your job that inspires you to keep doing what you're doing?
That's a great question. I think initially, or more frequently, what I get inspired by is my colleagues and their connection to the resource and to what they do. It's really inspiring to be trying to, like I said before, I'm shining a light on the work that they do for the folks that they're doing it for. So that's really inspiring for me, and just knowing that that's what keeps them going. A lot of these folks are people who put in well over 40 hours a week in order to make a difference, and they're very committed to the work they do, and they're experts at what they do. So it's really a privilege to be able to work with them. What's also, you know, personally re-energizing for me are those opportunities where if I am working with perhaps a news media outlet, or maybe I'm supporting a production of our own in-house video or something like that, or maybe an event, I get to go out and sometimes interact with the you know, natural resources too. So maybe that's actually, you know, being able to handle a bird as a part of a bird banding project, or, you know, perhaps be able to go see a habitat restoration project. And that is very energizing, and definitely is what helps me get motivated to keep doing the work.
So mainly you're communicating the science that's happening behind the scenes that you're telling the general public about?
Yeah, absolutely. And then just, you know, also doing reputation management too. So we work on really high profile projects that garner a lot of interest as well. It could be controversial endangered species issues. It could be energy related, like pipelines, climate change. You know, there's that side of things as well.
Great. That's incredible that they have a whole team of people that are doing that. That's
Yeah, it's
in our field that, like in the ecology department, we don't talk a lot about communication of the science that we do. We're more focused on data and analysis and all that kind of stuff. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah, and people, you know, there's you all are doing research and science in order to make a difference, right? And so you're informing the management that happens on the ground. And in order for management to happen on the ground, we have to have support for doing that work. We have to have the funding to do that work. We have to have advocates for that work. So a big part of what we're doing is making sure we're being transparent, for one, of course, because we are a government agency. So we are, you know, required. We really need to be transparent on how we're spending taxpayer dollars. We're also garnering advocates for the work we do, and support for the work we do, so that we continue to have the resources to be able to do that. So that's kind of, you know, you can sort of see the long-term need to be able to have folks and to be able to communicate about your own work. So having those skills built into what you do, I mean, the best part of when I'm working with subject matter experts is being able to coach them to be spokespeople on what they're doing, because they're the experts, and I'd rather them be communicating directly with whether it's through members of the public through events, or news media reporters, or something of that sort, members of Congress and their staff. You want the subject matter experts to really shine, and so I get to help those folks be prepared for that kind of work.
Do you have any suggestions on how somebody can communicate their science to have it resonate with somebody that's a non-scientist? Like, how do you bridge the gap of numbers and data to compassion for a species?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of different ways that we try to do that. Trying to think, for, you know, we've got folks who do our social media work, and they're on a daily basis trying to bridge that gap. And I'll just maybe speak to the example that I had from earlier today when I was talking with, I had our subject matter expert on the phone doing an interview for a online news outlet for the UK. And it was about the freshwater mussels that have been for about 4 years now mysteriously dying. Up to, it's like 90% of that population has disappeared. It was the most abundant freshwater mussel in that part of the river, and it's now, you know, very much significantly lower numbers. And I think, you know, we struggled at first to get attention for that work. So when biologists started noticing freshwater mussels were dying, we were, you know, they were sharing that story internally, trying to get attention and support for putting more resources towards that investigation. And then we knew that we needed to get support from our headquarters and our department. So, Fish and Wildlife Service, as I mentioned before, is part of the U.S. Department of Interior. So we needed to make sure our leadership was supportive of this, and we wanted to make sure the Department of the Interior was supportive of this work. And so we thought, well, if we can get some high-profile news outlets to know that there are freshwater mussels dying in droves and that it's a problem and we need to do something about it, then there'll be that kind of awareness that we need in order to continue to put resources towards that investigation and response. And so when we had to get the interest of those national outlets in order to do that. And so how do we get the interest of national outlets with a creature that most people have never seen, never noticed, and the only thing they know about mussels is what they eat from the ocean. So we spent some time thinking like, well, we know people really care about water quality, and they care about being able to have, people like to be able to see clear water in the rivers and streams. And so that was the angle we took. And we've got these great, I think from Virginia Tech, we have this great video of having two tanks of river water. One has freshwater mussels and one doesn't. And you could see within hours a difference in the being able to see through. And you just show people that, and honestly, it speaks for itself. And that was our kind of way of communicating this issue, was saying like, hey, which tank of water would you prefer? Obviously we're going to go with the one with freshwater mussels. And what does it mean when we don't have them? And being able to talk about how much water they filter, how they help stabilize the bottom of rivers, they create habitat for other species. So there's just all these pluses of freshwater mussels that even if we don't, most of us, if we're in the river, we're walking right on top of them without even knowing they're there, but they're truly fascinating. And so I think we just try to connect with those bits that we know people care about, which is, in this case, the water quality piece. People significantly care about water quality. So trying to do that is one thing. And then just telling the story about your work. And perhaps it's looking for interesting angles about how you perhaps gather data. So for example, when I think I mentioned the cannon netting for shorebirds. So we pitched that to National Public Radio, saying like, we literally have cannons that are shooting nets over the beach to try to capture the shorebirds. And so it was really kind of the technique that caught their eye. Like, that sounds fascinating. That sounds really interesting. It sounds like great audio for public radio. So sometimes we're using those kinds of angles where it's about more how you're doing the work as opposed to what or why. And then once you get them hooked, you get that opportunity to say the why and the what and the rest of your story.
That's really cool. I think we can open the floor for people if they want to ask a question, unmuting their mics and unmuting their cameras, and turning on their cameras. But before we do that, I have a question. Just as a person that works with bats, have you ever worked with communication about white nose syndrome, and what has that looked like?
Yeah, so I haven't worked as much as some of my colleagues, so that we kind of cover our own beat areas as well, just like journalists. So my beat area has been at-risk species, which actually includes bats, but I had a colleague that specialized in white nose syndrome. So because of the demands for communication on that, she actually devoted almost her entire position to that. And so I could try to speak a little bit to it, but she really primarily covered that. And honestly, they had networks of folks across the country that were involved in trying to make sure that we had really clear and consistent communications about white nose syndrome. So, we deal with misinformation all the time, and bats are a victim of that for sure. White nose syndrome is a challenge to communicate about, and making sure people are really clear on what we're talking about and the details of, how can you play a role in bat conservation, and what can you do to support sort of bats at large. And then there's also the need to be able to not, obviously, be able to, to not help in transferring this disease further than it already has. So there's a lot of messaging there, and so a ton of work went into trying to standardize messages, offer resources and information from a website. So I could answer possibly some more specific questions on it, but I had a colleague that really really covered it more than me.
That's so cool. Before people ask questions, another plug, Rutgers has a class called Field Technique. So if anybody hasn't taken it yet, we actually go out and do cannon netting. So it's a 2-week course for anybody who isn't close to graduation. You should take Field Tech, because we do learn how to do the cannon netting and we see the shorebirds. It's very cool. My partner actually works with the shorebirds and he cannon nets all summer long. It's a good time.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I should put a plug in for Bat Week 2020. So if you all don't know, there is, for the last at least, I don't know, a few years or so, we've been doing a Bat Week with Bat Conservation International and tons of other agencies and organizations. And this year's focus is on being a bat hero. So there's a number of basically activities that you complete to become a bat hero. So I'd encourage you to check out the Bat Week website. I think it's just batweek.org, and to be able to participate in that if you can.
That's great. Aiden, that was funny. He said Batman. You put it in the chat.
Yeah.
So does anybody have any questions for Meagan? You can unmute yourself. You can turn your camera on.
Got one. What was one of your favorite projects that you worked on?
So many good projects to choose from. I'll go with, I really like when we can bring science to communications, and we had this perception for a long time that every summer we were getting really horrible news media coverage on conservation related to piping plovers. If you all are familiar with piping plovers, it's a shorebird that breeds in on our coasts from really our entire coast in the region, and we try to protect. We work with a ton of people to try to protect those areas so that they can safely return, breed, nest, raise their young, and then go on their way each late summer and fall to migrate. And that can result in a lot of challenges for us, whether it's related to construction projects, building boardwalks, or doing beach management like raking, or perhaps adding sand to the beaches, building developments near beaches. And then there's also the direct communication with beachgoers and trying to make sure that they're disturbing the birds as little as possible. And so I worked with a bunch of different folks to come up with a strategic communications plan. And so we had people who were focused on various ways and tasks of conserving plovers from up and down the coast. And they worked with me to come up with this conservation plan. And it took us about a year or so. It can take some time if you really, really want to dig in. We used a process called Racey's model, which is research, action planning, communication, implementation, evaluation, and stewardship. And it really shows how some of the models that we use for planning conservation, planning and implementing and evaluating conservation, can be similarly applied to our communications work too. But to kick off some of that research, we wanted to interview our own folks and our partners to understand what were their perceptions of needs and challenges related to plover communications. How could we support those? But we also wanted to dig into that issue I mentioned first, which is this every year that there's this feeling of this onslaught of negative outreach, people being frustrated about being able to use oversand vehicles or camping on the beach or accessing their fishing sites using ORVs, or the construction projects that I mentioned before. And so we decided, let's partner with, at the time we were working with Cornell, to have students help us do some analysis, news media analysis. So we were able to look at, what was the tone of news media coverage. So we used our media distribution service, which is also a really cool part of the job, where basically we have this database that we pay for use of, and it allows us to monitor news media coverage, to identify news media contacts, to distribute information to news media, and be able to monitor, how many people are opening the emails, how many people are clicking through, so we can understand how effective we're being. So we partnered with these two folks to get an understanding of like, is the news media coverage positive, negative, neutral, and coming up with a way to, describe what would qualify as those things. And then to understand, was there an association between any sort of factors, like having a state agency spokesperson in the story? Was there a connection between that and having a positive story, or time of year? We looked at all these different factors to just understand if there was some connection there. And what we really learned through that was that primarily the coverage that we get on piping plovers is actually neutral to positive, like overwhelmingly. And that was really important for us, thinking about, well, where do we put our energy then? Because, we had this feeling that there was negative coverage when really it was, maybe a few stories, and that's all that was getting up to leadership. So we were able to go to leadership and say, hey, we did research and we found out that really we're getting a lot of positive coverage. And when we're looking at we were able to get some strategies for dealing with the negative coverage by looking at like the positive effect when we would have, or not effect, but the correlation essentially when we would have folks like state partners speak up on our behalf as well. And so we looked at all of those different factors and really were able to use that research to inform where to put our energy as communicators. And we try to do that all the time with like, we'll work with folks who do polling to understand, it's the Nature Conservancy who collaborates with a number of polling groups and provides like, what is the kind of language that people understand and relate with, and how can we use that sort of language to inform our communication. So to me, that's really powerful, is when we have the data that backs up how we communicate with people, what we say, and what we put our attention to, what channels do we use, that kind of thing.
Before somebody else has a question, I just want to briefly ask, does it help that piping plovers are just obscenely adorable? Do you find that it, like, you can
Absolutely.
Get more? Okay.
Yeah.
You're trying to bring people into conservation and like appreciating animals and caring for them. It probably doesn't hurt that they're very charismatic.
Yeah, and we find that like, so with the news media piece, or with like officials, like members of Congress, or perhaps even like local elected officials, giving them hands-on opportunities is really, really critical. So we were talking about bats before, and we had a member of Congress that really, by giving him in-person, hands-on opportunities related to bats, we were able to really turn him into an advocate for bat conservation. And that was really huge for us. And we've had that experience with news media and plovers too, where we set them up with a biologist and say, hey, can you just take this reporter out, show them what does it look like to actually be on, on the beach, and trying to identify where are the birds, where are the nests, what do they look like. It's very different when you get to see something. I mean, you all know when you see something in person versus, you're trying to understand over the phone or looking at photos. It's really a whole nother thing when you can be able to provide folks in-person opportunities.
Great. Does anybody else have a question for Meagan?
I do. It's Lori. What about, for instance, like insects that are not as charismatic, like such as bees? How do you communicate that with other people?
Yeah, so when we were talking about bees and pollinators, I think we focused on that kind of value that they bring to folks related to pollination and foods that we're all familiar with. So we created this like little video one year where it was like Thanksgiving with pollinators and Thanksgiving without pollinators, and like removed all the things from tables that pollinators had a hand in, so that people could really understand like, wow, there's a real clear connection between bees and other pollinators and the food that we eat. So we definitely try that. If there's like some way that we can connect the whatever animal it is to something that people care about, then we definitely try to build on that initially. But we also just talk about the value that all animals play in our life, in the life cycle, in the food web, and that even if we're not clear on what that value is, that there's something there that we may not know about. And the majority of, I mean, you all know, as in research and science, there's more that we don't know that we do know. So we have to be really careful about the potential loss of animals and of the roles that they play. And we talk about how, we're stewards of wildlife. That's what we are on Earth. We're here as caretakers. And so lots of times people have connections to why some plant or animal may not be doing well. It's usually tied back to something. There's something there that's related to people. And so we have the chance to repair that, to make a difference, even if it's not even connected. It could be decades, like with plovers, for example, their feathers were popular in ladies' fashion around the turn of the century or so. So that, of course, is not related to our connection to plovers now, but we certainly have a role in stewardship now for them, even if we weren't related to their original, one of the reasons for their original decline. And so we try to connect that back to, our sense of responsibility and opportunity. Like if we can do something, we should do something, even if it's not totally clear the value that they may play for people. And just kind of depends on the audience you're talking to as well. And so we try to be really clear on, who are you trying to communicate with right now as a part of this effort, and then do we have any information that informs their perspective? So trying to understand where people are coming from, listen, or if we can use any data that we have around those audiences to try to think about what might be effective in communicating to them.
Thank you.
I have a question. So, seeing that you deal with like media communication firsthand, would you say that in the past couple of years dealing with climate change and increasing environmental issues, do you think that people have been more closed off or open to like, I guess, environmental news, media, and conservation efforts?
That's a good question. I'd say that more than ever, people are looking for climate angles. We're getting that a lot, with this, I'll just keep going back to the same example, the freshwater mussel example. People were asking, is it climate change that's causing this? People want to know, is climate change playing a role? And it could be the kinds of outlets that we're hearing the most from. We work a lot with like National Public Radio. We work a lot with like the New York Times or the Boston Globe. And over time, many outlets have had to commit fewer resources, right, to environmental coverage. But I think that, my experience more recently is even though there may have been a decreasing interest in environmental issues at some point in time, but it's definitely not, it may be even more now. I can't say that with any data to support it, but it certainly feels like we have quite a bit of interest in general. I mean, it's been challenging the past 6 months or so, because really there's been a lot of other issues that that were warranting a lot of attention up until we had the more issues with wildfires and issues with birds out in the Southwest. So environmental interest is picking back up again related to those things. So it sort of depends just on what is caught the attention of the American public, or whoever, whatever those outlets are catering to, whatever has got the interest. And we try to pay attention to that and try to be relevant. That's, a big issue for wildlife agencies and conservation organizations, is trying to maintain relevancy with our constituents.
Without being political, do you find that it does change your job during times of one political party versus another? Do you think that working for the federal government and working with funding and care about the conservation and things about the environment, does that stay kind of even, or does it change?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've now worked across 2 administrations, and it's just that way in general with working for the federal government. Any administration change causes a big I guess you could say, domino effect of change across all the agencies at all levels. It might be felt, it's felt most certainly at the Capitol Hill headquarters kind of level, the regional level, and eventually makes its way down to folks working in the field on the ground, and just how you do things. How do you report up? What are the priority areas? It's just the nature of having leadership change. And it's the same way with organizations that have leadership change. It's just a little bit different when you're a part of a large bureaucracy, particularly preparation for change. So this time of year, we have to actually get prepared for potential change, and we're developing these briefings and information if just in case, and that's just what we have to do. We have to get prepared, and they may not be used, just depending on how the election goes, but that's the reality of working for the government. And then being able to if there is change, once that, like, so for me, once that happened with the two administrations I worked between, is you get a lot of new people that come in and they try to figure out how do they get up to speed, how are they being able to brief their bosses, what information do they need from us, all that sort of thing. So there's absolutely a lot of change that comes with potential changes in administration and leadership and all of that.
Thank you. Does anybody have a final couple questions before we say goodbye to Meagan? Just give somebody some time. Okay. Well, if nobody has a question, I want to say thank you so much for being here today. I really, really, really appreciate it. I found it really interesting. I'm sure everybody did. And this will be disseminated to other people from the state chapter and to the Rutgers Wildlife Society. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I was happy to. Thank you for joining and asking questions. And please feel free to share my information with folks. And if they want to reach out, if they have other questions, or if I can help connect you with some of the resources that I mentioned, I'd be happy to do that.
Great. I will absolutely do that.
Yeah. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thank you.